Welcome to the DatacenterHawk podcast. I am Mike Netzer, as always, joined by DatacenterHawk founder and president David Liggitt, a.k.a. Mr. Bench Press. Today is Friday, and when we are recording this, David embodies our core value of humility, so would never brag on himself. But as his coworker and occasional workout partner, would say that he is. If anything's ever trapped on top of David, I have no doubt he'll be able to extricate himself. So I don't know how that. Where's the real world application there? But
really achieved something in life.
Yes. Okay. Confession time. How many delicious Krispy Kreme donuts did you imbibe? Two as well.
Two today. They were delicious.
They were incredible. Clayton. Yes. Thursday night bet payoff. So
that's right.
Okay, so today we're talking about...
Canceled everything I did and workout with the first bite and every bite after that.
It's just, life is a series of checks and balances, and that was a check or a balance. I'm not sure which one it is, but it was not good for us to imbibe those donuts.
That's right.
Okay, so today we're talking about kind of a specific facet of data center real estate, which is, groups that have, an existing land holding. So in the past, we've talked about kind of the site selection, site acquisition process, and what you would want to be looking for as part of that process. This is really more focused on groups that have existing land holdings, potentially even some industrial buildings, some shells, and how to really think about, evaluating those sites for their, what's the word I'm looking for, readiness or developability specifically for data centers. So there's really some things you need to think about. And what we'll see is, as you're thinking about these things, each of these sites is going to have kind of pros and cons or strengths and weaknesses. We do a SWOT analysis on these sites.
Oh, there we go.
There's my business buzzword. People are like, what? SWOT? Yes, hashtag. Exactly. All the consultants just popped up.
That's right.
So Dave, let's talk about kind of like, as you do a very good job of like kind of setting the historical context. There's a lot of these kind of trends have developed over the years, and they kind of fit into some eras, as you will. Like, I know you're a big Taylor Swift fan, so everything's an era with David. But talk about kind of
delete all of
how
this.
Did we get here, and in where we are today, like what sort of things do you need to be thinking of? You may have 50, 100, 200 sites, and you go, we want to very quickly understand like which ones might be, an opportunity here from the data center standpoint.
Yeah. And there's certainly been times where we've seen this happen in the last couple of years, but right now in our space, and if you've watched, we've done one of these podcasts in the last few weeks on like land itself, powered land and normal land, and then we've done one on
normal land.
Yeah, it's terrible. We've done one on powered shells too. So I guess there are so many people out there right now trying to find these sites and areas that have power. There's some people that have it already or are not sure they have it, and they're trying to evaluate it, which is what you're talking about. So I think it's a really interesting thing to consider, especially on like if you think about the commercial real estate asset classes, office, industrial, retail, multifamily, and data centers, of course. The industrial kind of
life sciences.
Yeah, life sciences. Thank you.
Life sciences.
Yeah. Sorry. But the industrial, asset class is the most similar to the data center space, and we can kind of explain that. But back in the late 2000s, data center developers I think found themselves seeking a lot of the same things that industrial sites would. Larger amounts of power when compared to the office market, greater setbacks. They were just different. There were some similarities there, but the reality was the data center space didn't have, I would say, as much demand and as much maturity as it has now. So it wasn't really like competitive asset classes. They're just kind of similar.
Would you see those groups maybe competing for the same plots of land?
Sometimes, but you would just find them typically in like the same areas. So there wasn't a lot of because there was just more land and more power. The power constraint had not come yet. And even if you look back at earlier facilities, 2007, 8, 9, really to 2013, you saw a lot of retrofits of industrial buildings into data centers. And a lot of these, facilities, if you're in the commercial real estate market, the flex terminology, which is like the industrial building that has some office in it. So it allows, it would allow groups to have, a small amount of office space with the industrial component as well. And so a number of these facilities were bought and retrofit for the data center space. This was before, I would say, the industrialization of the builds of the data center. So it was I think what groups found out over time is like it's just easier and probably more cost effective to build like ground up, like purpose built data centers than it is to retrofit buildings.
And those buildings would have been 15 to 30 megawatts roughly?
Yeah, sure. 15, 30 megawatts, 150, 200,000 square feet, depending on the market that it was in. And obviously we're speaking about the US. And so I think you fast forward many years later and in certain areas you had both the industrial developers and the data center developers competing for the same plots of lands, which was what you were talking about, in very specific areas that data center users would want to be. There's two areas I'm going to provide, and there's others, but these are very like visible locations where this is and has taken place. So one, if you're in the city of Chicago, the Elk Grove Village area, which is by the airport. This area is has a very heavy data center footprint and a very heavy industrial footprint. And so you've seen some data center operators have to do some very creative things to get sites in that area because there's end users that really want to be specifically in that area. So that's one area that has had that characteristic. Another one is in Phoenix. This is in Mesa. So if you drive down, really it's Elliott Road, which splits on the north side, you've got a lot of data center development. On the south side, you have that as well. But you also have a lot of industrial sites too there. And so those are areas where you can see, we talk about a lot of stuff. It's a lot better when you can like visibly see what we're talking about. Those are two areas where you can actually see.
My guess is these guys are going to put up a little graphic over that.
We've got some graphic guys.
When this thing goes into post.
Yes, that's right.
Is that what it's called, post?
That's what it's called.
Okay.
That's right.
When this goes into post, we'll throw up the graphic.
What makes these, Anthony has joined our team, or the marketing and the video team, and our stuff's gotten a lot better.
Yeah,
we look a lot better on camera.
If you've enjoyed
glowing,
the videos
it's all
over
because
the
of
last
Anthony.
6-8 weeks, that is because of Anthony's addition to the team. So
that's right.
Well done, fellas.
But I think you've seen in the last couple of years, there's several larger groups that have a portfolio of land holdings or like industrial shells. And they're trying to figure out like, hey, does it make sense for us to participate in the space? So how much money do we need to raise? And we've even seen data center key leadership team members at data center operators leave those companies and actually go and start to be the head, the managing director of these different groups. And so I think what we want to cover today is, I think this would be interesting to talk through, is like, what do you need to think about? What do you need to do? What framework do you need to build if you have a portfolio, or if you're an investor and you're investing in these, to make sure and understand which sites could be good data center sites?
Yeah, like I said, a lot of these groups again have hundreds of sites, even globally. And so having a framework by which, like you mentioned, to almost like score these sites and go,
yes,
they're all going to have different advantages and disadvantages. So understanding what are those key metrics that need to be thought through, and then how important are each of them.
Yep.
And it's going to probably vary by market. It's going to vary by site. And so it just, again, extremely helpful for these groups because speed is the name of the game as well.
Yep.
So they've got a big domino taken out already, which is sites under control.
Sure.
And some of those already have the power. So, again, thinking back to past podcasts, they've got a good head start.
Yep.
And so now it's kind of like, okay, what's next?
Yeah.
So let's talk through like what are some of those key things to look at.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if I didn't say power availability, everybody like, you're an idiot. It's power. Of course, it's power. You have to understand, what type of power availability is at these sites, how quickly the power can be brought to the site. And so a lot of this is like right place, right time. You might have bought a site or a several hundred of acres where you're going to do industrial development, and you just happen to be in a place with an area where there's a significant amount of power available, and that's a huge advantage right now. And there are some people like that you'll see in the space today. So that's certainly one thing. And some of the sites that you might not have any power available. It might be a long time, and those would not be good candidates. But I think if you control the land, you control the site, and you have that power available, that's big. I would say also too, don't be scared off if a site can't do several hundred megawatts of power. I think a lot of people think right now, well, if you can't do 500 megawatts or a gigawatt, I shouldn't chase this market. If you have a site in a Dallas or a Chicago or a Phoenix or Northern Virginia, Atlanta, whatever the major and even secondary markets are, and you can do 24 to 48 megawatts, there's a whole enterprise market right now. Deals between 500 kW, 2 megawatts, 4 megawatts that in some ways have been forgotten about because everybody's chasing these large campus deals. And there's nothing wrong with that. the facts. That's just what's happening in the market today. So one is just, the power side of things. The second thing I would say is if you are your expansion capability on a site. So we've actually seen a couple of industrial developers have basically like an industrial shell already up, and because they have because they have land next to that, and they also have a path to power, you've got the opportunity to probably do more than, just one building or something like that. So that's a big part of it too, is there additional land to grow in the future?
Yeah. And each of those are going to have, like I said, the current size plus expansion size and rights and opportunities. There's like layers to this whole
That's
thing.
right.
And again, they all have different weights and, at the end of the day, come up with like a real feasibility for the site.
And actually, so that's, typically like either obviously just, land that you can develop on, or industrial land has some of the characteristics that a data center site would need. So that greater setbacks, there's a security piece to data centers that you have to have. And so the industrial sites just typically have more land that you can create that type of environment on than maybe some more congested areas. So anyway, the power availability, got to have it, but that's part of it. And don't be scared off if it's a smaller amount of power. Number two, I would say, I think we've kind of forgotten about it because, people say, it's table stakes, but proximity to connectivity is important. So, one of the questions, if you have these sites, like, how do I figure out where fiber is? Like, what fiber is out there? And am I in an area that has a dense population? So this is maybe a bit self-serving, but one of our, I'd say cousin companies, so datacenterHawk, but we work with a group. There's a group in our portfolio called Fiber Locator, and that's a great way to understand. You look at a site, you can see the fiber providers all around that site. Who's there, who isn't there, and that's a great way to very quickly understand. So if you have 100 properties, you got to run through some sort of framework to understand connectivity, and you almost need to rank each one. That's a great way to do it.
Yeah, and they've built some really cool tools that can show you kind of how you get from A to B.
Yes.
Shortest route, different types of routes, and you can do that across, like you said, a whole portfolio.
Yeah, and most likely, if you're in an industrial park or you're in an area that has, other use like commercial real estate use case, the fiber story is probably going to be pretty good. As you move out into more rural areas, those fiber stories and the connectivity and gets a little bit trickier. But here's what I'd say too is if you're trying to attract single tenants, so a hyperscale user, the number of fiber providers to that site is less important than if you are trying to build, like we talked about, that smaller enterprise multi-tenant data center. That's where you will need more fiber providers because the more customers you have, the more fiber providers typically make your site more attractive.
Yep. Again, all these problems are solvable, but there is a function of, again,
time
speed
and
to
money.
Market and of cost to get fiber there if it's not already.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, we talked about power, talked about connectivity. Okay, so then I want to talk about like proximity to site, like other things that need to be close to the site to make it make sense. So one are like other data center clusters in the market. I think if you have these sites, you have to figure out I think you said earlier, like, how do I sit within the current market? Like how do I appeal to, what's my property going to look like as it appeals to the other markets? So if you think like Dallas as an example, there's data center clusters in Richardson, Plano, Garland, South Dallas, Fort Worth. There's Allen. There's areas that have that happening, and so you got to know if you buy a site in Kaufman County, who's that going to like location wise, what's that going to look like compared to the rest of the market? Yep. And how does your portfolio kind of sit within that? If you're in Phoenix, it'd be North Phoenix, Central Phoenix, Chandler, Mesa, Goodyear, Glendale, Peoria, Chicago, downtown Chicago. We talked about Elk Grove Village. Things are moving towards Hoffman Estates. There's now a big data center development up in Grays Lake, which is on the north part of Chicago. Even outside of Chicago, Northern Virginia, you've seen it, but like Ashburn, Leesburg, Reston, Manassas, things are moving to Spotsylvania County, Atlanta, Lithia Springs, Suwanee, Fayetteville, Conyers. You just have to know how things sit within the market. And that's a really important part of it. And then the other thing I would add is like the hyperscale availability zones, especially if you have a larger site. Knowing where those are, how long they've been there, what hyperscale companies are in the market, which ones aren't. That's a really important part of it. And so I think you've really got to understand that if you're going to go make the investment to kind of chase this development.
Yeah. Understanding your point, like it can be distances to each of those things. And again, that's just yet another layer to put on top of the site analysis and go, who we think might be interested in this. If there's an existing developer there that may be looking to expand or develop for yourself, as again, close to those hyperscale users who maybe we've heard this concept of spillover demand. We've talked about this plenty of times on the podcast that, we've seen most of those hyperscale groups can't develop as fast as they'd like. And so if they've got an existing campus, there's some likelihood that they will kind of have additional need in that market. So seeing that existing, both hyperscale, what they've built today, if they've got their own land holdings, or maybe they don't.
That's good.
And so those are all, again, good data points to know as you're looking at these sites.
Yeah, and actually that's worth coming back to when we talk about the framework, because I want to remind me. But on the other two things, I would say, like the proximity, like how close am I to these things? Obviously, like the hazard risks of data centers and what you want to be close to, what you don't want to be close to. And there's a whole list. And to be honest, that's become less important over the last however many years. The thing I say a lot is, when I was doing CBRE data center site selection, we used to be far away from nuclear facilities. And now the industry is buying nuclear facilities. We used to be away from...
how the tables have turned.
That's right. Natural gas lines. Now it's like, does the site have a natural gas line?
That's a pro, not a con. It's a feature, not a bug.
It's been a wild, if you did all that work years and years ago, now the fact that that's not as important is kind of funny. The other thing is, like, each market has a carrier hotel, like a main building or one or two buildings that all of the connectivity will come back to. And so just your distance from that, knowing, where that is, and, there will be certain users and that value proximity to that, or value, obviously, connectivity back to that. So that's an important thing. And last thing I'll just share on this little piece is understanding how your site or that building sits, and the direct, like the adjacent surrounding properties. Because, if you have a site and it's in the middle of a huge residential area, you are going to face probably community pushback as you go to try to get a site permitted for data center development, or get your zoning changed from, whatever it was before to data centers. Most industrial sites typically have a zoning that allows you to do something similar to data centers. But I think you just need to be aware that, just because you declare, hey, it's a data center site, you'll have some people that will probably push back. And so those are just some things you should think about. Hey, how does my site sit within kind of the greater market? Because that's a big part of the story you're going to need to tell. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the framework from a data perspective. So this is where obviously we live on a daily basis, and trying to make sure you have the right data to understand how to move forward or not move forward. Sometimes the greatest thing, like
saying no, is a discipline, a business discipline.
Especially in the data center space.
Relationship advice, parenting advice, business advice.
I mean,
like a regular Simon Sinek over here.
That should be the little our little tagline. But the data that that you need to put together to understand. I mean, so one thing is just like the supply, like how much supply is in the market. So if you have a 100 megawatt site in a market that only has 200 megawatts, like, you're a big part of the market. If you're a 100 megawatt site in a market that has 3 gigawatts of power, it's a different story. And so just really understanding that side of it.
Yeah. What's the competition going to be like?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely. Understanding where other groups have already bought land, and again, where they're at in the development timeline.
And we talked about that on I think the land podcast we did, which was that planned power amount in every market has jumped in the United States has jumped up in the last really 18 to 24 months as people announce these big sites. Yesterday, there was a 5 gigawatt announcement in the U.S. I saw a 3 gigawatt announcement in another country. I'm not being ambiguous. I just can't remember what country it was.
South Korea.
That's right. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
South Korea. So, biggest data center in the world, allegedly.
There we go. So,
I'm going to build one that's 7. So now it's the biggest announcement. Yeah, that's right. Do you have a site? No, I'm going to build one.
No. So I think that's a really important part. You got to understand, like, what's the future going to be in the market. Another thing that we are, really, I think people need to be really interested in understanding is the demand and the absorption that takes place on an annual basis. I mean, we track it on a quarterly basis, which is, there's certain people in our space that need that data, that, quarterly data, market to market, country to country, region to region. But most people can kind of make the decisions off of like, okay, what's been the annual demand from a power standpoint, from a megawatt standpoint? So, our like commercial real estate people, this is kind of your absorption number that you see in a market. And we don't have, in the data center space, we don't have like necessarily all the move outs that the office market typically would have. So one of the things the commercial real estate office market has to work on, and the industrial market too, is you're obviously people are moving out, people are moving in. The data center space, you can move in, but it's very hard to move out. and that's one of the reasons why it's a really attractive space to invest in, is because it's really hard to move your IT infrastructure. And a lot of people,
sticky.
If it's working, you really don't want to mess with it. So that's, part of that is the demand side of things.
And I would add one, I mean, maybe the most important thing is if you've taken your 100 sites and you've done this work and you've done the framework, but another really important overlay is like, what's kind of the pricing in each market? So understanding the pricing differential between a Dallas and Chicago and Phoenix, and going like, if all other things are held equal and we think we're going to get $5 more per kW per month at this site versus this site, that's very meaningful.
Yeah, sure.
And so as you're doing like some of the financial modeling for some of these sites, like understanding, not just the demand, but the pricing and how is pricing trended.
Yeah, sure.
In these markets over time, that's a huge part of this exercise.
Yeah, and paying attention to power cost, paying attention to like tax in states that are tax incentives, AI legislation. I mean, that's something we're watching too, because that can really shift things fast. Is the legislation. That's a good point. It's like the power. It takes a long time to get to the finish line. The legislation can easily change the way people are looking at different states, and
or the utility providers kind of policy changes. One thing we've seen a lot. That's probably a whole separate podcast, but those are kind of coming out more and more, these large load restrictions or regulations.
Or one of the groups, one of our team members told me the other day that a state in the U.S., not to be named,
she's such a tease.
Just made an announcement on, or there's a bill where basically like the data center user would have to self-report on, power usage, and I forget the other part of that. If it was maybe water usage or AI or like purpose of facility. And I'm like, they ain't doing that. It's like I get the idea, the regulation idea to try to figure some of these things out, but our industry just historically has not worked that way.
It's not taking too kindly to that type of folk.
That's right. You're the Gordon Keith
to regulation.
That's right. Not Hank. You.
But understanding that is massively important, because some of these are happening very quickly. To your point, they're like the tax incentives that they can be implemented relatively quickly, and and it has a massive impact on the development. I wanted to
going back to what you said earlier about the hyperscales, like companies building themselves, and they can't build enough, and so like leasing requirements come up. I think that's like really important with the data that if you're evaluating this, really understanding the nuances behind the data, because you might look and go, well, this hyperscaler's building 400 megawatts in this market. Why on earth would I ever build here? And it's like, to your point, it's like, well, historically, those companies have been so successful internally, and also too, they're acquiring other companies. So the infrastructure is changing that, they have a 20 megawatt requirement that they cannot place within their 400 megawatts of projects. And so it's really just understanding like how I'm going to look at this data, but what does it really tell me? And how to understand, like, even though these things, there's a gigawatt of power being built in Northern Virginia right now. It's like, why would I ever build there? Well, because 98% of it's leased.
Yeah. And because we believe that the demand could be 4 or 5 or 10 or 20. Right. And so in many of these markets, the supply is still so far below the demand that there will be opportunity. Yeah. So just anyway, kind of bring it back to sports, bring it back to the that's right. Bring it back to the kind of main focus of this. If you have a portfolio, whether it's land or industrial sites, it's really important to understand just the framework to walk through site by site, kind of creating that scoring system,
and build a framework that would allow you to figure out which sites make the most sense. Because it is, if I had 10 sites, 5 sites, 50, 100, dude, I would look at every one and make sure that I've ruled out that, hey, we've done all the work here. None of these are, suitable for data center development, or, we've done the work and we actually found 5 that are, because it, like I said, if you do 1 or 2 of these deals, it's worth it.
Yeah, moves the needle. And I think going back to the beginning, these groups have the leg up. They've got the sites already.
Yep.
They've got the development teams. A lot of them do. They've got the capital.
Yep.
And so they've got they've solved a number of the key pieces of data center development, and they're just kind of going, okay, what's next?
Yes.
So if you are one of those groups, or you're thinking similarly, and this has kind of struck a chord, we'd love to be helpful. And I think to your point, we've got a lot of the data and tools that can help make these decisions like very, very quickly, and can do that analysis across a large portfolio. So reach out. Love to talk to you. datacenterHawk.com obviously give you great information. Some of the past podcasts we've done as well, but we'd love to talk to you, and we'll see you next time.